We're going to start now. Okay, so in the beginning, God created absolutely everything. We open the Bible, and the first book of the Bible is Genesis. In Genesis 1, we learn that God created absolutely everything. Okay? And so theologians will attribute the word shalom to what it looked like at the beginning of creation. We kind of think of shalom as peace, but it's so much more than that. The Hebrew word of shalom actually means this universal flourishing, rhythmic order, perfection, and joy. So picture no disease, no death, no destruction, absolute joy and perfection, this rhythmic order to everything's just working the way it's supposed to work. And that's how God intended His creation to be. That's what we see in Genesis 1 and 2. And so we actually get a plot involved in the story when we turn to Genesis 3, so we don't have to wait very long. This is called the fall. So God creates Adam and Eve, and Adam and Eve bought into the lie that we still buy into today, that we think God is holding out on us. So that was really at the heart of the sin when they ate the fruit. The devil said, God is holding out on you. There's actually more joy that you can be experiencing. And they believed that. They bought into the lie. And when they bought into the lie, everything absolutely fractured. So this perfect rhythmic order of the universe, now we get death, destruction, disease, famine, broken relationships with other people. The most devastating result of what is called the fall is not just what happens on earth, but the relationship with humans to God. As a result of sin coming into the world for the first time, we learn in the Bible, specifically in Genesis 3, right out of the gate, that mankind cannot have a relationship with God with sin in our lives. We're separated from a God who's perfect and holy and desires us to be perfect too. And so this is a big problem, right? Right out of the gate, we learn that we cannot have a relationship with God because there's sin involved. And so religion, really all religious systems, agree with this. They agree that something is wrong with the human condition. And so what religion really does is it seeks to figure out an answer to how do we fix what's fundamentally flawed into us so we can be acceptable to whatever God or supreme being that religion adheres to. Okay? And so Christianity, you're going to find out through tonight, is completely different than all other religious systems, that we do not have a passive God who sits back and says, you guys need to do in order to come to me. We serve a God through Christianity who relentlessly pursues us ultimately through Jesus. So I'm getting way ahead of myself already, so let's go to the next slide. So we realize this fall happens in chapter 3 of Genesis. What's going to happen next? So we don't have to wait very long. Chapter 12, God says, I'm going to do something about it. I have a plan in place where I'm going to fix absolutely everything, and I'm going to do it through a human guy named Abraham. And so he comes to Abraham and he says, through your offspring, Abraham, I'm going to fix absolutely everything. I'm going to raise up someone eventually who's going to right the wrongs of everything that went bad in Genesis 3. And so there's really two huge repercussions of this. One, it shows us that God desires relationship with His people. He has a plan in place, despite what the humans did to screw up everything in chapter 3. He has a plan in place to fix it. How awesome is that? God has a plan in place from the beginning. And two, He chooses to include humans in that plan. So you'll see all throughout the Bible, God uses imperfect people. He uses ordinary people to do some incredible things. So that's called the covenant of Abraham. So the rest of Genesis, you're good. The rest of Genesis will actually follow Abraham's offspring. So we see Abraham has a son named Isaac. Isaac has a son named Jacob, who has a son named Joseph. And we trace the storyline of Abraham through the book of Genesis. So the next book is Exodus. So we're moving along in history. This is about 600 years later. The start of Exodus, from the time of Abraham to the beginning of Exodus, is about 600 years. So the people of God, now called Israel, are in the land of Egypt. They're enslaved by a pharaoh in Egypt. He's threatened by their large number, and so he enslaves this people. And so this is a threat to God's promise. If God's going to actually save the people through Abraham's offspring and they're enslaved, something's got to happen, right? God has a plan in place. Who does He raise up? Moses. God raises up this guy named Moses, let my people go, right? Moses says, let my people go. He goes, with God's help, he carries the Israelite people out of Egypt, and they start heading towards this promised land that God has promised them. So God picks up his people out of this enslavement and moves them towards the promised land. They stop along the base of this mountain called Mount Sinai. And this is where we get our second covenant that God gives us. So God says, I'm going to pursue you. I have a plan in place. I desire relationship with you, but there's a problem. I'm perfect and you're not. So what are we going to do about that? And so he calls Moses up on the mountain and he says, Moses, because these people are imperfect and I'm perfect, they need to learn some rules if they want to be in my presence. So this is really where we get our 10 Commandments from. It starts with 10 Commandments, and there's hundreds of other commandments after that God says, if you want to be my people, you need to follow some rules. You need to meet the standard of perfection because I'm perfect. Now, what's going to happen if you give imperfect people a list of like 600 commands? What's going to happen? They're going to break them, right? They're not going to be able to keep all of them. So, what does God do next? The next book after Exodus is Leviticus, and so this is where God deals with when there's sin, when there's junk in people's lives, what's going to happen. So we learn in Exodus that God's solution to the problem of sin is sacrifice. Specifically, what that sacrifice means is there needs to be a blood payment whenever there's sin involved. So because we're just skimming over this, I'm not going to get into that. That would be a great question to jot down. That seems kind of harsh, Brian. Why does there need to be a sacrifice for a petty little sin? Why does a blood sacrifice need to be paid for a petty little sin? That would be a good question to ask when we're done. So God creates the system of rules, but also when the Israelites break these rules, the system to pay for these mistakes. So they pack up their things and they head towards the promised land. They eventually land in the promised land, but there's an issue when they get there. It's inhabited by some other people. They get to the promised land, they're like, God, we're here, we're ready to go, but there's some people over there, so what are we supposed to do about that? And so the book of Joshua is going to detail how the Israelites actually go in and actually take over the land that's inhabited. So that would be another good question. That seems kind of harsh that they had to send their army and defeat these people. So as I continue to talk tonight, write questions down, because we're not going to stop along the way to answer those, but there are some really great answers to those questions. So they get to the promised land. They defeat all the inhabitants of the promised land. They get to the land. They live there for a couple hundred years, and they look around. They say, all these other nations have kings. God, we want a king. Give us a king. Okay? And so there's 3 main kings that get all of the ink in the Old Testament. Saul, David, and Solomon. Those are the 3 main ones that we'll talk about. Saul was about a foot taller than everybody else. He was a man's man. He was a good-looking dude. When you thought of what a king was, Saul just absolutely personified that. So Israel could not have asked for a better king just on outward appearance than Saul. But Saul had his flaws. Saul was very much like the Israelite people that God took from Egypt to the promised land. They complained constantly. They disobeyed God. They failed to trust God's promise of blessings. Saul was just like that. So God said, sorry, Saul, you need to hire your replacement. So he takes this prophet named Samuel, and Samuel's going to go find his replacement. Samuel goes to this guy named Jesse, and he says, Jesse, I heard you got some sons. Bring them on out. I want to see if the next king is amongst your sons. So he brings out like 7 of his sons. He checks out all of them, and none of them, God does not tell Samuel that any of these are the ones. But he does say, I think Jesse has another son somewhere. Samuel says to Jesse, I feel like God's telling me that you're maybe holding someone back. So Jesse says, yeah, I didn't think you'd want this guy. It's my youngest son. His name's David. He's a little shepherd boy. I'll bring him out and just see what you have to say about him. So he brings him out. Samuel says, that's the guy. David is the guy. David is the next king. So David's a shepherd boy. He plays the harp, but you do not want to mess with David. what does David do?